Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for chapter 4.1, which is about Macedonian and Hellenistic empires and the rise of and fall of the Roman Empire. Next slide. By around 338 BCE, Philip of Macedonia had subdued the Greek city-states and had created an empire. And here's a map down here that shows the extent of the conquest and empire of Philip after the so-called Golden Age of Rome in the 4th century BC. Next slide. After Philip's assassination, his son Alexander took over and expanded his empire to include much of the known world. Alexander, known as Alexander the Great, was one of the great conquerors of the ancient world, and he conquered territories all the way from Greece over here in the west to India over here in the east. And that was much of what the Greeks knew of as the known world at that time. Next slide. As a result of these conquests, a new Hellenistic culture which emerged, which blended Greek and other ancient civilizations. And that is one of the great accomplishments and legacies of Alexander, even though his empire fractured after his death. The unifying of Greek and Persian and even into Indian culture was one of the great legacies of that conquest. Next slide. Hellenistic culture produced two conflicting philosophies, Stoicism and Epicureanism. These were two diametrically opposed philosophies. The Stoics, this philosophy which lasted into the Roman period, was based on self-denial and kind of a minimalist look of life, whereas Epicureanism had a completely different view of life, where they valued emotion and enjoying life and excess and so forth. So these two philosophies grew out of the Hellenistic world. Next slide. By the 2nd century BCE, the Hellenistic kingdoms were conquered by a new and more powerful empire, Rome. And this was certainly in the West the largest ancient empire, which basically grew around the Mediterranean Sea. And the Romans would dominate that part of the world for hundreds of years. Next slide. Rome started as a village on the Tiber River in modern-day Italy. It established a unique republican form of government around 500 BCE. For centuries, Rome, unlike much of the rest of the world, was ruled by a primitive form of democracy where Rome's elite ran first the city of Rome and then the early empire of Rome with a so-called republican form of government, that is a representative form of government, kind of the ancestor of modern democracy. Next slide. Rome's rise as a world power began with its wars with its rival Carthage. As a result of victories in the Punic War, Rome conquered a vast empire. The Punic War or wars, there were several of them, took place in the 200s and 100s BCE, and ultimately Rome proved victorious over Carthage after a long struggle. Carthage was a formidable foe for Rome, but Rome subdued Carthage and used that as a springboard to dominate that part of the world for centuries. Next slide. Julius Caesar seized power in 49 BCE, and this brought an end to the Roman Republic and turned Rome into a monarchy. Rome was transformed by Julius Caesar. He's often referred to as the first Roman emperor. He, with his army, turned Rome into a military dictatorship. Caesar himself was assassinated in 44 BC, but from his time on until really the end, Rome would be dominated and be ruled by emperors, and the old republican form of government would wither away. Next slide. For the next 500 years, Rome had dozens of emperors. Some were good, some were not. The length and stability of Roman rule is remarkable, and that is certainly true. Next slide. Rome is famous, most famous for its law, language, and engineering, and there are reminders in Europe, even today, of Rome's legacy. For example, this structure here, a primitive aqueduct that the Romans built over 2,000 years ago, still stands, and there are examples like this throughout Europe. Next slide. The empire began to weaken in the 300s BCE. In order to cope with numerous issues, Emperor Constantine divided the empire. And so around 300 around 300, a little bit later, in the Christian era, the Roman Empire was divided, and that preserved the empire somewhat, but it also ended the period of dominance that Rome had over the entire region. Next slide. In spite of these efforts, the western half of the empire was conquered by Germanic forces in 476 Christian era, and Rome's long period of dominance would end. Next slide. And that's it for chapter 4.1. See you later.